Aloha, and welcome to another edition of A Better Day. I'm State Senator Sam Slom. And look, do you wonder why the price of your groceries costs so much? You wonder why everything costs so much? Well, part of the answer is in something that's known as the Jones Act. And one of the Senate minority staff members, Dr. Kimberly Kepner-Sybounmy, has produced a film that explains all about it. Kim?
Hi, Senator Slom. Yes, the movie that I developed came out of research that we did following our Jones Act video conference last year, where we got together with Puerto Rico and Alaska and discussed through bipartisan effort the cost that the Jones Act puts on the non-contiguous trades, the portions of the country that are not connected to the U.S., and I made a movie to help explain the impact of that.
And most people don't understand or have not heard about the Jones Act, but it affects us every day. So your movie tries to explain what the basics are, how it works, more importantly, what the options are. What we're going to do after the movie.
Well, after the movie, it encourages people to get involved, to contact their congressional delegation. And hopefully this summer, starting this summer, we will have forums where we will help educate the public, businesses, and how the Jones Act affects them.
And we do have resolutions that are going through the state legislature this session, urging our congressional delegation to take action. Look, it's in your interest. It can reduce costs here. It's not the total answer, but it is part of the answer. So right now, you make up your mind for yourselves. Let's all watch this movie that Kimberly has written, produced, directed, and animated herself about the Jones Act.
People in Hawaii often wonder why living in Hawaii is so expensive. This video provides an explanation of a coastal shipping law and describes how it contributes to the high cost of living for Hawaii residents. It also shows how the law creates challenges for people living in other ports not connected to the U.S., like Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Finally, it outlines a possible solution to the high shipping costs that have resulted in the suppression of economic growth for these areas. Hawaii has had strong economic ties to the U.S. mainland since the 19th century. In 1826, the U.S. and the Kingdom of Hawaii entered into a treaty involving commerce and navigation, encouraging the commercial planting of coffee and sugarcane. In the 1850s, Hawaii's sugar exports surpassed all other commerce between the islands and the U.S. mainland, demand steadily increasing due to the U.S. Civil War and the gold rush of the West. An 1849 treaty removed the duties or fees on ships moving to and from Hawaii. Further privileges were granted in the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875, spurring sugar production and allowing the U.S. use of lands that are now known as Pearl Harbor. In 1900, Hawaii became a U.S. territory, and pineapple, macadamia nuts, and a commercial tuna fishery, along with sugar, sustained the economy through the first half of the 20th century. The importance of Hawaii grew steadily, and it became a state in 1959. Hawaii's economic and strategic significance to the U.S. has grown over the last 130 years, and the shipping between Hawaii and the U.S. mainland is now fully domestic and regulated by the coastwise laws of the U.S. Unfortunately, as a result, the residents of Hawaii have increasingly become captive consumers due to a protectionist law, the Jones Act. The Jones Act is more formally known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. The purpose of the act was to end the coastwise waivers that permitted the use of foreign-flagged ships which were ordinarily prohibited from domestic trade and required to pay fees when arriving at U.S. ports, returning the routes then to U.S. carriers. These waivers were granted during the U.S. participation in World War I, when many U.S. ships were requisitioned for the war effort, leaving the non-contiguous or secondary ports without enough ships to meet their needs. In addition, Section 27 of the Act, originally proposed by Washington State Senator Wesley Jones, was designed to cut out shipping competition from Canada for routes between the Northwest and Alaska, and to look out for U.S. security. There were three main goals of the Jones Act. First, it established the Merchant Marine, which was meant to ensure that the U.S. would have a fleet of ships that could carry domestic and foreign commerce to and from U.S. ports. Second, it established sea lift capacity. This meant that in times of war or emergency, the U.S. Navy could call upon these merchant ships to support it by carrying necessary supplies to U.S. positions. The third goal of the Jones Act was to maintain the shipbuilding and maintenance capacity of the U.S. In order to accomplish these three goals, the Act requires U.S. carriers, these are the companies that own and operate ships, to use only U.S. flagged or Jones Act ships to carry U.S. cargo among U.S. ports. First, the ships delivering goods from one U.S. port to another need to be built in the U.S. Second, the ownership of these ships must be at least 75% by American citizens. Third, the sailors on these ships also need to be American citizens. Lastly, only the U.S. carriers that use Jones Act qualified ships, which are registered under the U.S. flag, can conduct the business of transporting cargo by water between U.S. ports, loading and unloading it once there. Consequently, ships that do not meet all three criteria and are not registered under the U.S. flag cannot, after unloading their cargo, pick up other U.S. cargo and then deliver it to another U.S. port. Similarly, the law states that foreign flagged ships can enter a U.S. port to offload imported goods and pick up U.S. products to take to another foreign market, but they cannot pick up U.S. cargo and deliver it to another U.S. port. While the goals of the Jones Act seem like good ideas, the consequences of the stipulations hurt the people of Hawaii. Specifically, the requirement in the Jones Act that the ships must be built in the U.S. serves to make the prices of goods much higher for smaller secondary ports like Hawaii. The reason for the higher prices is the lack of competition in two areas. Lack of competition among U.S. shipbuilding companies, which drives up the cost of new ships, and the lack of competition among the ocean carriers that serve the secondary ports, both of which contribute to higher consumer prices. To gain some perspective on the lack of competition among U.S. shipyards, it makes sense to look at the same industry in other countries. Currently, Japan has the shipbuilding infrastructure to build approximately 300 or more large commercial vessels a year, not including those for its domestic use. South Korea produces the largest container ships in the world, and including China, the greatest producer, these three countries produce over 90% of the world's large vessels. In contrast, the U.S. shipyards only produce an average of 2 1,000 gross ton or larger ships a year. That's because there are only 7 U.S. shipyards capable of building vessels of this size. Of these, 4 build exclusively for the U.S. Department of Defense, leaving only 3 shipyards to build commercial vessels. This lack of competition reduces efficiency and results in prohibitively high costs for building new ships, up to 5 times the cost of comparable ships built in Asia. If one of Hawaii's carriers orders an 850-foot ship from a U.S. shipyard, the company would have to wait for 4 years for delivery and pay $209 million. That means over the course of using this ship, the carrier must make up an additional $164 million that wouldn't have been necessary if the ship had come from Asia, costing only $45 to $50 million. No wonder shipping a 40-foot container of goods like hardwood flooring from Shanghai to Los Angeles is approximately $2,300. But sending the equivalent 40-foot container from Los Angeles to Honolulu is estimated by one carrier to cost over $8,000. It is common for carriers to charge a bit more for routes to smaller, less populated ports. They are operating smaller ships that carry less cargo than the Trans-Pacific carriers, which utilize large container ships that are too big to enter the harbors in the smaller ports. This reality, coupled with the fact that carriers prefer to sail their Trans-Pacific vessels using Great Circle routing, meaning vessels travel further north where the circumference of the Earth is significantly smaller than through Hawaii, are all done in effort to save time and money. Granted, many of the large carriers leave the west coast of the U.S. half empty. We don't export as much as we import. But it is still not cost-effective for them to travel to the smaller non-contiguous ports, since the smaller populations require fewer goods. So there is far less competition for the non-contiguous trade lanes. Thus, the result is the U.S. ports not connected to the U.S. mainland rely heavily on ocean shipping and bear most of the cost burden of the expensive U.S.-built ships. The higher prices are then passed on to the Hawaii consumer. So here's what happens. The lack of competition among U.S. shipyards raises the price of new Jones Act ships. This means it's difficult for additional ocean carriers to buy a ship and come in and compete for the business of shippers needing to move goods between the U.S. mainland and smaller secondary ports. Thus, the lack of competition, or threat of it, among carriers puts them in a position to charge higher prices in effort to recoup the higher cost of U.S.-built ships. The higher prices are then passed on to the Hawaii consumer. It should be noted that the populations together for the non-contiguous ports, Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico, make up only 2% of the U.S. population. Yet they pay an overwhelming portion of the higher costs caused by the expensive ships. The impact on the cost of living for Hawaii residents is seen every day in the cost of food. In fact, the United States Department of Agriculture estimates the monthly cost of food for a family of 4 on food stamps is significantly higher in Hawaii when compared to the average of the other 48 states. A Hawaii family on food stamps requires $1,088 in assistance each month, while families on the mainland receive an average of $650. Also, the USDA estimates that Hawaii families on low-cost budgets pay $1,424 a month, mainland families $847. Families on moderate-cost budgets in Hawaii pay $1,710. Mainland families, $1,055. The difference adds up when comparing staples like bread. The U.S. Bureau of Statistics estimates that a family on the mainland pays an average of $1.98 for a loaf of bread. Hawaii, $4. On the mainland, cheddar cheese averages $5.57 per pound. Hawaii, $8. Potatoes on the mainland, 67 cents a pound. Hawaii, $2. The impact of higher shipping costs also shows up in the cost of Hawaii's electricity. The state imports 100% of the petroleum used to meet Hawaii's electricity demand. The state imports both crude and refined petroleum products from Pacific Rim producers, Africa, Russia, South America, and the Middle East on readily available foreign flag tanker ships. but it has limited shipping options to bring in U.S. products due to the scarcity and expense of the Jones Act tankers. In recognition of this, the governor's Hawaii State Refinery Task Force's final report of April 2014 recommended the state seek a Jones Act exemption, allowing foreign flag tankers in Hawaii in order to expand the supply of fuel sources at more competitive prices. As of July 2014, Hawaii pays over 38 cents per kilowatt hour, nearly twice as much for electricity as states with the next highest prices, Alaska and New York, which pay over 20 cents. In the commercial sector, Hawaii pays 35 cents. The U.S. average is 11. And finally, in the industrial sector, Hawaii pays 31 cents. The U.S. average is only 7. The high cost of electricity is, of course, factored into the cost of goods and services sold through local businesses. That means paying for goods, food, and fuel takes a larger portion of one's paycheck in Hawaii than in any other state. Let's evaluate whether the 3 protectionist regulations accomplished the 3 Jones Act goals. Number 1, in the words of the Jones Act, does the U.S. have a fleet of the best equipped and most suitable types of vessels sufficient to carry the greater portion of its goods to and from foreign and domestic ports? The answer is no, since in 1955 there were 1,072 U.S.-built commercial ships that were 1,000 gross tons or greater. By 2000, the eligible fleet consisted of 193 ships. And by 2014, the number stands at 90. Number 2, does the U.S. have a fleet of the best equipped and most suitable types of vessels sufficient to serve as naval or military auxiliary in times of war or other emergencies? This goal is also not met. The Department of Defense routinely hires under charter foreign vessels when appropriate Jones Act vessels are not available. Similarly, in the Persian Gulf conflict, the Military Sealift Command shipped more than a fifth of its dry cargo with foreign charter vessels. Another example is the Maritime Administration's Ready Reserve Force. It provides security and transports Army and Marine Corps unit equipment during surge periods before commercial ships can be marshaled. It relies on a fleet where 65% of the ships are foreign-built. Clearly, the U.S. lacks the capacity to build the ships needed, so the armed forces meets the demand by buying foreign-built vessels. The military also relies on chartering commercial U.S. flagged ships from the U.S. flag Foreign Trade Fleet, which is comprised of 89 vessels. While this fleet operates under the U.S. flag, 100% of these ships are foreign-built, and half of those being foreign-owned. Has the U.S. ensured the shipbuilding capacity necessary to maintain the merchant marine? Again, the answer is no. The most glaring evidence is the number of U.S. shipyards with the capacity to build commercial ships 1,000 gross tons or larger. It has decreased drastically over the past few decades to only 3. And again, the fact that the armed forces buy foreign-built vessels to complete their fleet illustrates how the artificial ship shortage caused by the Jones Act is circumvented in effort to support the security of the nation. It should be said that most countries in the world have their own laws regulating coastal shipping, but few still include a domestic build requirement. In an international survey, the Maritime Administration of the U.S. found that out of 56 countries, 43 reported some crewing restrictions, 37 had some ownership provisions, and only 6 had some form of domestic build requirement. The U.S. seen as having one of the most restrictive. The European Union began liberalizing its restrictions in the late 1990s and then in 2009 to include the new members, as have Australia and New Zealand, in large part because local build provisions are economically impractical. In fact, in examining the effects of the shipping law, in 2012, the World Economic Forum pointed out regulations like the U.S. build provision in the Jones Act damages local economies and saddles businesses and subsequently consumers with significant costs. The forum further explained that the lack of competition forces businesses to use high-cost suppliers that use inefficient shipping operations, many with old ships that are too expensive to replace, so they have high environmental costs. These older ships, which burn different grades of bunker oil, then send sulfur and nitrogen chemicals into the air, affecting marine plants and animals and causing breathing problems in people. In a series of 4 studies, the U.S. International Trade Commission concluded that the U.S. consumer pays for the protection the Jones Act provides to the shipbuilding industry. Up to $2.8 billion in some years. Estimates of the cost of living increases in Hawaii range from 17% to 69% higher than the U.S. average. And the 2013 Government Accountability Office report acknowledged that when Jones Act vessels were not available for certain products, businesses in Puerto Rico were likely to import goods from foreign locations rather than source U.S. products, which were often closer. Lastly, the International Trade Forum of 2009 suggested that in the case of the United States, the removal of market access through the requirement of own country build puts the cost burden on the ship owners, which is transferred to the cargo owners, and therefore ultimately placed on the shoulders of the consumers of these goods. This is most evident in the non-contiguous trades like Hawaii. So what could be done to bring some relief to Hawaii's residents and businesses? In order to provide the best conditions for economic growth for Hawaii and other smaller secondary ports like those in Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico, several solutions have been proposed. In the past, there have been efforts to secure temporary waivers to the Act and to repeal the Jones Act in its entirety. Several other actions have been taken over the past decades. Alaska, the state with the greatest amount of coastline, must bring the bulk of its goods in by ship and consequently is highly affected by the shipping law. In 1982 and again in 2008, the Alaska legislature passed a statute that compels the governor of the state to do everything in his or her power to remove the restraints of the Jones Act. Recent efforts to make changes in the other trades or non-contiguous ports are beginning to gain traction. In April of 2013, a senator from Puerto Rico introduced the Senate resolution with a goal to direct the Puerto Rico Senate to investigate the impact of the Jones Act on the Commonwealth. It held extensive hearings in January and February of 2014, listening to various stakeholders, with the final report to come later in the year and a possible introduction of a resolution in the 2015 session. In April 2014, the legislature of Guam passed a bipartisan resolution calling on Guam's Democratic Congresswoman to introduce federal legislation exempting the non-contiguous jurisdictions of Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico from the U.S. build requirements of the Jones Act. Guam sees its effort as necessary because even though it is already exempt from the domestic build requirement of the Jones Act, it still suffers negative effects because the natural shipping route from the west coast of the U.S. goes through Hawaii, requiring U.S.-built ships. Most recently, in a bipartisan effort, Hawaii legislators introduced resolutions during the 2013 and 14 sessions, each requesting the Hawaii congressional delegation introduce and Congress to enact federal legislation that would exempt the non-contiguous trades from the domestic build requirement of the Jones Act. Thus, the current goal for the non-contiguous trades, or ports, in Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico is to work together to seek a targeted exemption to the U.S. build provision of the Jones Act. This would simply allow ocean carriers that serve these 4 ports to buy large self-propelled ships that are foreign-built, while still complying with the other provisions, U.S. ownership, employing crews of U.S. citizens and being registered under the U.S. flag. There are arguments that Hawaii would lose over 20,000 jobs that are dependent on the Jones Act. However, this is a common misunderstanding. The Jones Act exemption requested by the non-contiguous trades reports refers only to the U.S. shipbuild provision. The number of shipyards that build new, large, self-propelled ships in Alaska is 0. In Hawaii, 0. And finally in Puerto Rico, 0. So the number of jobs that would be lost, 0. Based on what we know about the Jones Act now, it makes one wonder, why should Hawaii remain captive to a protectionist law that doesn't effectively protect U.S. shipping commerce, shipbuilding capacity, or U.S. security, and forces the non-contiguous ports to shoulder a higher percentage of the Jones Act burden? If you are in favor of reducing the cost of living in Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico, you can contact members of your congressional delegation and tell them to support a Jones Act shipbuild exemption.